Carmela Soprano is one of the most important forces in Tony Soprano's life, not because she is involved in the day-to-day business, but because she is the one person who can touch every part of him at once. She lives in the house where Tony tries to feel normal. She raises the kids whose futures Tony uses to justify everything, and she benefits from the money in a way that cannot be separated from what it costs. When you talk about Carmela's influence, you are not talking about a side character who nags the main guy and then disappears. You are talking about the pressure system that shapes his mood, his decisions, his image, and his sense of meaning. A boss can handle enemies, rivals, and the occasional betrayal. What is harder is handling the person who knows your routines, sees you when you are weak, knows where the money comes from, and still expects you to be a husband and a father like the men on TV. The first thing Carmela does for Tony, in the best version of their marriage, is create a home base that feels stable even when everything else is unstable. Tony's life is built on constant risk. Every meeting can become a problem. Every phone call can bring bad news. Every day he has to project certainty even when he is unsure. Carmela, at least on the surface, gives him something that looks like order. The house is clean, the dinners happen, the kids have schedules, the holidays are planned, the social events are arranged. That kind of structure matters more than people admit, especially for someone like Tony who lives with constant stress. A boss cannot be in full combat mode 24/7 without cracking. The family environment becomes a controlled room where he can pretend he is a normal guy for a few hours, and that illusion is not just comfort, it is fuel. It helps him get up the next morning and do the same ugly work again. But Carmela's home base is not just emotional, it is strategic. It is part of Tony's brand. In their world, a boss with a wife, kids, and a respectable suburban life reads as stable, traditional, and legitimate. Carmela doesn't just decorate Tony's life, she gives him a cover story that other people accept because it looks familiar. The neighbors may not know details, but they see the big house, the family, the church appearances, the events with other couples, and they register him as a successful local guy. That is not nothing. For criminals who survive by blending in, domestic respectability is camouflage. Carmela plays a huge role in maintaining that camouflage because she cares about appearances the way Tony cares about power. In a strange way, they are both image managers. Tony manages fear and loyalty. Carmela manages status and normality. Carmela also gives Tony something else that helps him professionally, even if neither of them says it like that. She gives him a sense of what his life is supposed to be for. Tony is not the kind of man who can admit that he needs moral permission, but he does. When he talks about doing it for his family, he is not just making excuses. He is building a psychological shield. Carmela, by being the wife and mother in the house, makes that shield feel real. He can look at her, look at the kids, look at the life, and tell himself the sacrifice is worth it. That is why their marriage is so tangled. Carmela is part of the justification engine. She makes the lie believable enough for Tony to keep going. Without that, he might still do the same crimes, but he would feel them more directly, and that kind of exposure can make a boss reckless. In the same breath, Carmela can also be a stabilizer in Tony's behavior, even when she is not trying to be. Tony's worst instincts are isolation, indulgence, and rage. He can get lost in himself. He can start believing his own myths. He can drift into appetites that make him sloppy. Carmela, simply by having expectations and boundaries, sometimes forces him to come back down to earth. She demands that he show up. She demands he be present at certain family moments. She demands he take responsibility in a way his crew never will. His guys benefit when he is generous or when he is violent, so they have no incentive to hold him to anything deeper. Carmela does. That doesn't mean she has moral superiority, but it does mean she is a counterweight. When a boss has no counterweight at home, he can become pure appetite and pure ego. That tends to end badly. She also provides Tony with a certain kind of intelligence he does not get from the street. Carmela is socially sharp. She reads people. She understands status games, jealousy, resentment, the little wars that happen between couples and families. Tony is street smart, but Carmela can see the domestic social battlefield, and that can matter because their criminal world overlaps with their legit social world. Fundraisers, weddings, family events, and neighborhood interactions are not separate from the business. They are where alliances form, where grudges grow, where reputations are made. Carmela is a guide in that territory. She can warn Tony about how a thing will look, what people will assume, and what kind of message it sends. For a boss, perception is reality. Carmela understands that instinctively. Then there is the money, and this is where the influence becomes both good and bad at the same time. Carmela wants security. She wants assets. She wants the kids to be safe. She wants the future to be protected. In a normal family, those desires would push the husband towards stability and legitimate planning. In Tony's case, those desires push him into a cycle where he must keep earning at a high level. Because the lifestyle Carmela maintains is expensive, and because once you live at that level, stepping down feels like failure. Carmela is not alone in that. Tony loves luxury too, but Carmela's influence turns the lifestyle into a moral expectation. It is not just that Tony wants a nice house, it becomes that Tony owes it to the family. That transforms greed into duty. It makes the whole machine harder to shut off. And Carmela is smart enough to know what she is doing with that, even if she avoids saying it out loud. She asks for the kind of security that requires dirty money, but she wants to feel clean while receiving it. That tension becomes one of the most defining dynamics of Tony's personal life, and it leaks into his work life constantly. When Tony is under pressure, he becomes more aggressive, more paranoid, more controlling. He takes it out on the crew, on rivals, on anyone who makes him feel disrespected. Where does that pressure come from? It comes from the street, yes, but it also comes from the house, where Carmela's expectations are constant. She wants the benefits of the role, and she wants Tony to keep performing the role, but she also wants the comfort of believing she is not truly part of the ugliness. That contradiction doesn't just harm their marriage, it shapes Tony's emotional weather, and his emotional weather shapes the business. One of Carmela's biggest positive influences on Tony is that she gives him a reason to pause. Even when their relationship is tense, even when he is unfaithful, even when they are fighting, Carmela represents an anchor to a life outside the crew. Tony's men live in a bubble of constant validation and constant violence. Inside that bubble, the rules are simple, loyalty is rewarded, disrespect is punished, weakness is exploited. At home, Tony has to deal with rules that are more complicated. He has to deal with feelings, hypocrisy, denial, forgiveness, and the long memory of family. Carmela forces him to practice a different kind of power, one that does not involve immediate punishment. Sometimes he fails at it. Sometimes he tries to bully his way through it, but the fact that he has to face that arena at all keeps him from becoming completely one-dimensional. At the same time, Carmela's presence can also make Tony worse, because she can turn his criminal identity into a permanent emotional conflict instead of a problem he can compartmentalize. If Tony could fully accept himself as a criminal without shame, he might actually be calmer. But he can't. Part of him wants to be seen as a provider and a good father. Carmela pushes that part of him, sometimes sincerely, sometimes strategically. When she calls out his behavior, or when she draws lines, it creates shame and anger. Tony is the kind of man who turns shame into aggression. If he feels judged, he lashes out. If he feels trapped, he cheats, he lies, he escalates. Carmela can activate that cycle because she is close enough to trigger the parts of him that other people never touch. You see this most clearly in how Tony uses the business to regain control after domestic stress. When the home life becomes unstable, Tony often returns to the street life with extra intensity. He looks for situations where he can be the decider, where he can feel powerful, where he can force outcomes. That is not just because he likes control, it is because his house is the one place where he cannot solve everything with force. Carmela can resist him, she can withhold approval. She can expose his hypocrisy, she can make him feel like a bad man. When that happens, Tony tries to restore his identity by being an even stronger boss. That can lead to overreactions, harsh punishments, impulsive decisions, and unnecessary conflicts. So Carmela's influence, even when she is not involved in business at all, can indirectly raise the temperature of Tony's leadership. Another way Carmela affects Tony's work life is by influencing what he fears. A boss's decisions are shaped by his priorities. Tony's top priority, deep down, is not money or even power. It is the family unit staying intact and the illusion of normality surviving. Carmela is the center of that unit. When Carmela threatens to leave, when the marriage seems unstable, Tony experiences it like a threat to his identity. That can make him more desperate. Desperation in a boss is dangerous. It makes him take risks he normally would not take, or hold on to arrangements that are unhealthy because he needs the cash flow. If the domestic stability is shaky, Tony might chase quick money. He might push people harder. He might tolerate disrespect from someone he should discipline just to keep operations smooth. Or he might discipline too hard because he needs to feel strong. Either way, the home life changes the way he reads every situation. Carmela also has a complex influence through the children. Tony loves his kids, but he also uses them as a narrative. Carmela is the one who manages their development, their education, their futures. When Carmela pushes for certain things for the kids, Tony has to pay, and that pushes him back into earning mode. But it also pushes him into a deeper sense of responsibility because it keeps the future in front of his face. In some moments, this makes Tony better. He tries harder to be present. He tries to resolve certain problems without violence. He tries to set boundaries with the crew so the kids are not exposed. In other moments, it makes him worse, because the kids become the excuse that justifies anything. It becomes easy for Tony to say he had to do what he did because the tuition has to be paid, the lifestyle has to be maintained, the future has to be protected. Carmela, by being the one who constantly organizes and demands those future outcomes, becomes part of the machinery of rationalization. There is also the spiritual and moral angle. Carmela wants moral clarity. She wants to feel that there is a version of her life that is acceptable, that she can stand in front of the community and not feel like a fraud. Sometimes she looks for that clarity through religion, sometimes through social respectability, sometimes through acts of charity and community involvement. That urge has a good side. It can push Tony to consider consequences. It can make him feel accountable. It can force him to reflect on what kind of legacy he is building. In a healthy marriage, that could be a force for ethical change. But in their marriage, it often becomes something darker, a negotiation. Carmela's moral discomfort turns into bargaining power. She does not just want Tony to be better, she wants Tony to compensate her for the discomfort of knowing what he is. That compensation often comes in the form of money, gifts, status, and control over certain decisions. The influence here is bad not because Carmela is uniquely evil, but because it turns morality into currency. It teaches Tony that guilt can be managed with payments, that domestic peace can be purchased, that conflicts can be solved with material comfort. Tony already thinks that way in business, but when it becomes a pattern at home, it deepens his worst belief that love is conditional and that power is the only reliable tool. This is a big reason why Carmela can be both Tony's shield and Tony's wound at the same time. She gives him warmth and structure, but she also makes him feel judged and cornered. She wants him to be a family man, but she also benefits from the part of him that can be ruthless. She wants him to be stable, but she also demands the kind of lifestyle that comes from instability elsewhere. That contradiction is not just Carmela's contradiction, it becomes Tony's. He is constantly switching masks, and Carmela is one of the main people forcing those mask changes. When he is with the crew, he is the boss. When he is with Carmela, he is the husband who must prove his worth. When he is with the kids, he is the father trying to appear respectable. When he is alone, he is a man trying to convince himself that any of this makes sense. Carmela sits at the center of those identities, and that makes her influence huge. Carmela also affects Tony by controlling access to intimacy and comfort. In Tony's world, loyalty is enforced through fear and rewards. At home, fear does not work the same way, at least not consistently. Carmela can punish him in a different currency: emotional withdrawal, disapproval, coldness, and the threat of leaving. For someone like Tony, who is emotionally underdeveloped and who struggles with vulnerability, this is a brutal form of pressure. It makes him chase comfort elsewhere, which is part of why he constantly seeks relationships outside the marriage. Those relationships are not just lust, they are escape hatches. They are places where he is not judged, where he can be the charming provider without being confronted with hypocrisy. Carmela's influence here is indirect but powerful. The more she becomes the moral mirror, the more Tony runs from the mirror. But this also creates a cycle where Tony's cheating and lying give Carmela more moral leverage, and Carmela's leverage gives Tony more resentment, and the resentment pushes him deeper into the habits that created the leverage. This cycle affects the business because Tony's emotional chaos bleeds into his leadership. When Tony is emotionally stable, he can be strategic, he can be patient, he can make measured decisions. When he is emotionally unstable, he becomes reactive, he takes slights personally, he punishes unpredictably, he becomes harder to read, which makes his own people anxious. A boss being hard to read is dangerous, it makes the crew paranoid, and paranoia creates mistakes. So even if Carmela never steps into a meeting, she can still change the entire atmosphere of Tony's organization, because she changes Tony's mind. There is also something very important about Carmela's role as a witness. Tony's crew sees him as the boss, his enemies see him as an obstacle. But Carmela sees him as Tony. She knows the boy behind the posture. She knows his insecurities. She knows the things he regrets. That means her opinions can hit him harder than anyone else's, even if he pretends they don't. When Carmela looks at him with disappointment, it confirms the fear he carries, that beneath the power he is still not good enough. That fear is one of the hidden engines of Tony's ambition. He is not just chasing money. He is chasing a feeling of being untouchable. Carmela can puncture that feeling. Sometimes, that helps him. It keeps him human. It keeps him connected to something real. Other times, it makes him double down on being the boss, because the boss identity is the only one that feels safe. Carmela's influence on Tony's work life also shows up in how she interacts with the other wives and families. She is a kind of social queen in that circle. She understands the hierarchy, she enforces it, and she benefits from it. That matters because in organized crime, family is not just personal, it is part of the political structure. The wives socialize, they compare notes, they build alliances, they spread stories, they keep grudges. Carmela's position affects Tony's position because if Carmela is respected, Tony looks more legitimate. If Carmela is humiliated, Tony looks weak. A boss cannot afford for his household to look like it is falling apart, because in their culture, household order reflects leadership order. Carmela knows this, and Tony knows it too, even if neither of them articulates it as strategy. Now, when you talk about the bad influence, you have to be honest about the fact that Carmela can encourage Tony's worst tendencies simply by participating in the lifestyle. Carmela does not hold a gun, but she enjoys the benefits. She lives in the house, she wears the jewelry, she drives the cars, she attends the events, she wants her kids to have advantages. This is not a simple moral condemnation, it is a reality of complicity. The influence becomes bad when Carmela's demands and tastes push Tony toward more crime, more risk, more pressure, because he must keep the machine running to keep her satisfied. Carmela often frames it as wanting safety, but the kind of safety she wants is expensive, and Tony's legal options are limited because of who he is. So her desire for security becomes, ironically, a pressure that makes their lives less secure because it keeps Tony in the war zone. Carmela can also be a bad influence in how she handles her own moral conflict. Instead of making a clean break, she often tries to reshape the situation so she can keep the benefits and reduce the guilt. That can look like pushing Tony to make certain legit moves while still expecting the same lifestyle. It can look like trying to extract a separate financial safety net that insulates her personally. It can look like using Tony's guilt to get control. This does not make Carmela a villain, it makes her a human being in a trap. But the influence on Tony is still negative because it teaches him that the marriage is transactional. It teaches him that honesty is punished, that vulnerability is risky, that love is negotiated through leverage. Tony already thinks like that in business, and Carmela reinforces it at home, which makes it harder for Tony to ever grow emotionally. On the other hand, Carmela's best influence on Tony is that she forces him to confront the consequences of his life in a way that the crew never will. The crew will always find a way to normalize the violence and the corruption. They will joke about it. They will rationalize it. They will treat it like weather. Carmela, when she's at her most honest, refuses to fully normalize it. She wants to pretend sometimes, but she also has moments where she cannot. Those moments matter because they remind Tony that his life has a moral price. Tony hates that reminder, but it is one of the few things that can break through his self-deception. A boss surrounded only by yes-men becomes monstrous fast. Carmela, by being a recurring source of discomfort, prevents Tony from becoming entirely detached from reality. The key idea here is that Carmela is not simply good or bad for Tony, she is a multiplier. Whatever Tony already is, Carmela can amplify it. If Tony is trying to be better, Carmela can support that by making home feel meaningful and by rewarding stability. If Tony is trying to be worse, Carmela can still support that by enjoying the benefits and by turning moral conflict into bargaining. She reflects his choices back at him, and because Tony is emotionally reactive, that reflection shapes what he does next. This is why the question of how important it is for a boss to have a good wife is not just a romantic question, it is an operational question. A boss is a pressure cooker. He has to manage violence, money, loyalty, betrayal, and constant risk of exposure. If his home life is chaotic, that chaos becomes a second battlefield. 2 battlefields is how you lose. A good wife in that world, if we define it in the most practical way, is not simply someone who stays quiet and looks pretty. A good wife is a stabilizer. She is someone who helps maintain routine, helps manage stress, helps protect the boss from his own impulses, and helps keep the household from becoming a source of constant drama that spills into the business. But there is a darker version of that idea too, and the show makes it clear without needing to spell it out. A boss might want a wife who helps him feel justified, who keeps up appearances, who participates in the lifestyle, and who does not challenge him too hard. That kind of wife is good for his short-term comfort and possibly his public image, but she may be terrible for his long-term survival because she allows the worst patterns to continue unchecked. The best kind of partner for a boss, in terms of survival, is probably someone who can keep the household stable while also preventing the boss from losing his soul completely. Someone who can set boundaries without turning every boundary into a war. Someone who can demand respect without using guilt as a weapon. Carmela almost becomes that person at times, but she never fully commits to it because she is trapped between what she wants and what she knows. If Carmela truly prioritized moral clarity, she would leave. If she truly prioritized comfort and status, she would stop confronting Tony and simply enjoy the benefits. Instead, she lives in the middle. That middle position is exactly why her influence is so intense. Tony is constantly trying to manage her, please her, avoid her judgments, and win back her approval. That is emotional labor. Tony does not want to do, but cannot escape. And because Tony cannot escape it, he tries to solve it the same way he solves everything else, through control. That desire for control is what makes Tony dangerous at work and miserable at home. You can also argue that Carmela is one of the main reasons Tony stays alive as long as he does, because she keeps him tied to routines and responsibilities that prevent him from going fully feral. A boss who lives like a bachelor, chasing appetite non-stop, tends to make more enemies and create more chaos. Carmela forces Tony to have a schedule that includes family obligations. That means Tony has to constantly move between worlds, and moving between worlds can keep a man from getting lost in one of them. Tony might hate the constraint, but the constraint keeps him from becoming an even bigger target. It also keeps some of his men in line, because they see Tony as a family man and treat him with a kind of traditional respect that matters in their culture. At the same time, Carmela can also make Tony more of a target, because the lifestyle she helps maintain is visible. Big houses, expensive tastes, and social presence attract attention. They create envy. They create gossip. They create law enforcement interest. A boss who keeps a low profile can sometimes survive longer. Carmela's idea of the good life is not low profile, it is success on display. That display is part of the dream, and Tony buys into it too, but Carmela is one of the forces that keeps the dream in the foreground. Again, she is a multiplier. She magnifies Tony's desire to be seen as a winner. When you step back, the most honest way to describe Carmela's influence is that she is both Tony's conscience and Tony's accomplice, sometimes in the same scene without either of them admitting it. She is the person who can look at him and make him feel like a terrible man, and then later accept the benefits of the terrible things he does. That inconsistency drives Tony crazy, but it also keeps him psychologically functional. If Carmela only condemned him, he might break. If Carmela only enabled him, he might become a monster without friction. The friction is what keeps the engine from flying apart instantly, even as it burns them down slowly over time. So when you say it is important for a boss to have a good wife, the show pushes you to ask, good for what? Good for his public image, good for his emotional stability, good for his moral growth, good for the children, good for the business. Those are not the same thing. Carmela is good for Tony in the sense that she gives him a life to return to, a structure to lean on, and a human mirror he cannot fully ignore. Carmela is bad for Tony in the sense that she strengthens his rationalizations, intensifies his stress, keeps him tied to an expensive illusion, and turns the moral conflict into a constant negotiation that makes him more reactive and more controlling. And maybe the most important point is this. Carmela is not just influencing Tony, she is showing what happens when a criminal boss tries to build a normal family life on top of a foundation that is not normal. Carmela is the normal life he wants. She is also the proof that he cannot fully have it. She makes the dream feel real, and then she makes the dream feel impossible. That push and pull is the story of Tony Soprano in a nutshell. He wants love without accountability, respect without vulnerability, family without consequences, and comfort without change. Carmela, by being close enough to demand more, forces him to feel the contradiction. Whether that makes him better or worse depends on the day, but either way, it makes her one of the strongest influences on him, not just as a wife, but as the living reminder that power does not solve every problem, especially the ones that wait for you at home. If you want the clean takeaway, it is that a boss's wife is not background noise. She is part of the boss's ecosystem. She can keep him grounded, or she can keep him hungry. She can protect his image, or she can expose his weaknesses. She can calm the house so he can lead better, or she can make the house a war zone that bleeds into the street. Carmela does all of these things at different times, which is why Tony never fully escapes her influence, even when he tries to outrun it. For Tony, Carmela is the one person who can make him feel like a king and a fraud in the same hour, and that is exactly why she shapes both his personal life and his work life more than almost anyone else.